Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Brett Blease. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a principal technical support engineer on the support team. I'm located in Raleigh, North Carolina in the United States. My main focus these days is still QlikView, but I'm also now part of the digital support team. So I'm spending a lot more time out on the community, just FYI. So if you want to ask me something out there, feel free to hit me up on the community pages. And I've been with the company 15 years and 5 months now. Today we're going to talk about migrating your QlikView environment. And I do want to reiterate this is QlikView only, not QlikSense. Basically we're going to cover migration and what is it. I'm going to cover some key help links and other information that will be useful to you. I'm going to cover the key files in your QlikView architecture that you want to make sure you've got copies of or backups of handy when you're doing the migration. And then we're going to basically do a migration of a single node environment to a multi-node environment, which will cover kind of both use cases. So in theory, you could do single to single, but I decided to do single to multi just so that people can see the more complicated method. But I'll try and focus on what you would do if it was a single to single verbally, so you'll know what you need to do if that's your use case. And then we'll do a demo of this where I'll walk you through everything, and then we'll cover some things to remember at the end of the presentation. So, migration. What is it? Basically, when you're doing a migration, it's usually due to hardware changes or other physical changes to your environment, not just an upgrade. You're actually moving from one server to multiple servers, or you're moving from old hardware to new hardware. You may be adding additional servers for scaling up and out, or you could be moving to a new data center provider, or you may be moving to Azure, Google Cloud, or one of the other cloud providers in your area. Basically, this can also come in handy when you want to run a new version of the product and keep your old version in parallel. Now, in order to do this, you're going to need separate license keys. Just FYI, you won't be able to use the same licenses in both environments. That's going to likely cause you issues. So if you do want to run parallel environments, you already either need to have two sets of license keys you can use, or you would have to ask your account manager for an extra set of evaluation keys, which would match your environment keys that you're going to be trying to mimic for you to use to test with that. And the last thing I wanted to cover here, a lot of folks get confused with the remote management service, thinking this is how you do a migration, but that's really not what the remote management service was meant for. The remote management service is meant more to just migrate tasks from between environments. So if you have a development environment where your developers do all their work and you want them to be able to migrate tasks over to QA or production, that's usually where you use that remote management service. The big catch with that service is both environments or all environments are going to be using that service amongst each other need to be on the same release. You can't mix versions. Things won't work correctly if you do. So I wanted to be sure I pointed that out, that you're going to want to use the method I'm talking about today if you're actually trying to change servers or change environments and things. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Basically, you're going to want to check your system requirements, the migration help pages, backup and restore QlikView help pages, and the PowerTools XMLDB viewer tool from PowerTools. So your system requirements you'll find at help.qlik.com, and if you just click the documentation link here, you can go to QlikView. The system requirements page basically lists all of the operating systems that are supported. For the desktop, gives you recommended processors, memory, and keep in mind these are minimum requirements. So you're likely going to need a lot more than what this says, unless you're a bare bones shop. We cover browser support, which versions of browsers we support, and for which clients. You got your QlikView server requirements, OSs, and note here that the client OSs are for development testing purposes only. Basically repeat the other stuff, IPv4 versus v6, and what browsers the management console will use, and then some QlikView Publisher, QlikView Workbench information on that page. And if you're running a different, right now mine's set to April 2019, which is the 12.40 track. If you need to switch to other tracks, we've got 12.30, which is November 2018, and we've also got 12.20, November 2017. These are the current supported releases outside of 11.20, and 11.20 is still, it didn't get to the online help. That's, you have to go to the actual PDF files in the 11.20 track. If you need other versions in this, go to this archive link. and then you'll see the option to choose those old releases there. I'm not going to click that because that'll take me off this page. But we also have an upgrading and migrating QlikView server help site now, which covers best practices. You can link, they've got links in here to some of the other areas. The digital certificates, that's one other thing that I mentioned on the slides. When we go back, you're going to want to come out here if you are running certificate trust, because you've got servers in a DMZ environment, or there could be some other reasons, but DMZ is usually the main one, because the DMZ environment doesn't have access to the domain service account that the internal servers are using. So in that case, a lot of times you have to use certificate trust instead. In those cases, you're going to want to make sure that you checked out this certificate area, because you need to make some changes and get those certificates backed up and migrated over when you do the migration as well, for everything to work correctly, because there's some information that's encrypted in the QVPR files that will not work correctly unless you get those same certificates pulled over. We cover upgrading on the same machine, upgrading on multi-server, some stuff on maximizing uptime, and then upgrading to a different machine. So they pretty much cover everything now as far as, and then we got a migration and restore. A lot of this I kind of took out of the help. I have my own way too, but feel free to read through this. It's really good now. There's only one thing I'll point out. On the upgrade and migration, the help recommends that you go ahead and upgrade your existing environment and then do the migration to the new environment. I sort of disagree with that, but you can do it either way. But in general, I find that most customers want to have that current environment remain on that other release, especially if they're doing an upgrade and migration, because they want to be able to roll back to that other environment. So you can do that. You can leave that existing environment as it is and do the install of the new release in the new environment, and then we can migrate what we need from that existing environment to the new environment. So you've got your tasks and everything all pulled over. And you can see over here, if you're coming from 11.20, you'll want to check this link out too. And then the next tab I did was the backup and restore area, which, as you can see here, that's the main page, but then you've got a backup and upgrade prep and a backup and restoring certificates. This is where I talked about the certificate trust. You'll definitely want to review this area if you've got that in play in your environment. We're not going to have time to cover that today, unfortunately, but I wanted to be sure and point this out to everybody. And the last site is the Power Tools, and these are unsupported, again, just FYI. So if you have questions on things, there are some articles on some of them. So if you do have a problem, search the article or knowledge base and see if you can find something there to help you. If not, you can always come out to the community. This is a community.qlik.com, and just search for Power Tools, and you should be able to find this page. I'll include the link so you guys won't have to go hunting for it too. There's a download link here, so you can click that, and that'll give you the download. And even though this says 1220, the XMLDB viewer, I have been using it in 1240. It does work fine, so there's no need to worry that because it's not listed here that it's not going to work for you. Now, some of these other ones I don't know. I haven't tested all of them, so just keep that in the back of your mind. Let's jump back to the presentation. The next thing I wanted to cover was making sure if you're doing an upgrade as well as a migration, make sure you cover all your interim release documents so that you're aware of the new features that are in that release, as well as any other, and you may want to review the bug fixes just to see, what you're getting in each of those interim releases, because what's new doesn't always carry forward. So you're going to want to make sure you check all of them to make sure that you know exactly what you're getting in the end. This next bullet I kind of picked up on as I was putting this presentation together. One thing that can really help is ensuring that your management console resource names on the QMC system setup area, that those resource names are generic, that they don't have server names or environment, specific environment, I should say. You could do like prod, QA, and dev, but if you have like server names and stuff in there, you're probably not going to want that, because it's going to make it a little harder to do the migration that way, whereas if you keep it generic, that's one less thing you have to change when you do the migration to the new environment. I covered this next point a little bit already. Ensure you've got that other set of license keys if you're going to run the old or existing environment and the new environment concurrently. You don't want to use the same publisher and server keys in those environments, as that's probably going to cause you issues if you do. I can't emphasize this one enough. We've had a lot of customers that do this and then realize they've done a bad thing after the fact. So If you're changing source document, so if you have a publisher license for your environment and you want to change your source document folder setup, don't change existing folder paths until you get things situated. If you change them via the management console, you'll end up breaking the links in the QVPR files to your tasks. So everyone's going to stop working if you do it that way. So I'll be sure and cover what you need to do. And the only tricky part is if you want to add folders, it's a little confusing in that regard, and that you need to add those new folders via the QMC, but then you've got to manually go into the QVPR files and reassign your source docs to those new folders. You don't want to do it via the management console, or again, it'll break the task, and I'll show you why that happens here in a little bit. Our key files in the QlikView environment, the Cal Data PGO, that's got all of your named and document Cal user assignments and doc assignments in that file. If you don't want to have to redo those in the new environment, you want to make sure you've got that Cal Data file to copy over from the existing environment to the new one. The QlikView servers in the new environment should be able to read that and make sense of everything, provided the domain's not changing or we've got other environment things that potentially are changing that could be a problem. Your QVPR folder and files. And one key thing with this one, you want to leave the backups folder out. Only bring the QVPR folder files minus the backups folder. The danger of bringing that backups folder over to the new environment is if somebody panics, if something goes wrong, and does a restore from a backup from the old environment, that's got the wrong server names. And if that old environment is still up and running, when they bring up that backup in the new environment, everything's going to point back to your existing environment, and all of a sudden you're going to have a major mess on your hands because you've got two management consoles trying to get to things. And one other thing I just learned the other day, at least in 1240, I'm not sure about earlier releases, it's probably in 1230 as well would be my hunch. If you have two management services hitting the same resources, the management console will give you a banner message telling you that multiple management services are in use. So that'll give you an immediate clue that, oh, wait a minute, I've got something bad going on in my environment, and I've got another management service pointing to these servers. I need to go find out where that is and get the service URLs changed or shut down. The QlikView server settings any file. The useful thing here is if you've added a bunch of settings manually to your environment, things that we've told you to put in, you can grab the settings 7 section of the settings any. I'll try and pull that up for you guys so I can show you what I mean, but there's a settings 7 section and then an authentication section. The authentication area is the license info, so that you don't want to migrate, but the settings 7 information, you could copy paste that over into the settings any file in the new environment once you get that one going. That'll save you some trouble trying to configure things. Just be sure if you do that your folder locations are going to be the same. So if you're using UNC paths in the existing environment, then you'd want to change those in the settings any or leave those out of your copy paste and leave what you've got set up in the other file on the other environment. Hopefully that makes sense, because you don't want the two environments pointing to the same file shares. QlikView web server config. This one's probably not a big concern. It's just some of the web server configuration settings. Generally, there's not much you change in this, but it'd be probably a good idea to have it just so you can check it and see if anything has changed that you've got to double check. Certificates, if you're running a certificate trust, you want to make sure per the help page I showed you that you've got those. And then each of the services have an exe config file. If you've made any changes to any of those config files, I would make sure you grab a copy of those files and you check that old version against the new version, and you make those same setting changes in the new environment. And then, of course, we got our source document and user documents. Source documents being the publisher files. That's going to be your QVWs, QVDs, and any Excel files or other source files you use in that environment. And your user docs are your access point folder documents that the QlikView servers read. And that's going to consist of your QVW files, your meta files, which contain your category information, and if you're running the QlikView server in DMS security mode, that's got your authorizations in there as well. And then you've got your shared and T-shared files, which have your user bookmarks or user objects in them. So be sure you bring those over to that new environment along with the QVWs if you want to make sure the users have access to all those objects they've already created. So here's what we're going to do in the demo. We have a single node, our Qlik server 1, which is designated by old here. and I've got all the services running on one server in this current setup on server 1. What we're going to do is we're going to migrate the management service to a new server called Qlik Server 2. I'm going to put the distribution service and the directory service connector on server 3, and then I'm going to add a publisher cluster node on server 4. I'm assuming here I've got a publisher license that allows me 2 cluster nodes. And then on Qlik Server 5, I'm going to move my QlikView server service. I'm going to create a second directory service connector so I can have failover just in case my DSC goes down on server 3 or 5 and vice versa. And then I'm going to put the web server on server 5 as well. And server 6 will be a cluster node to go along with server 5 for scalability purposes. Now, one question you're probably asking is, hey, you're going from a single node environment to a cluster setup. So the trick here, when we do the migration, we're going to migrate so that we only migrate to the primary servers. So QDS, I'm only going to tie in at first to the Qlik Server 3 service. And the same thing for the QlikView server. I'm going to do server 5. We'll add the cluster nodes after we do the migration from the single node environment. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. And we're going to use the XML-DB viewer and the QVPR files to make the changes we need to make on things. Okay, so this is server 1. You can see in the management console, I've got all my services here, and everything's on a single server. I've got my source docs and my user docs. Okay, so I've had some distributions. I had some errors you could tell in the beginning there, so that's why some of these are here and some aren't. And then on the system tab, I've got all my settings, and I've got my license info. I'm going to jump over to server 2, which if you remember from the PowerPoint, server 2 is where I'm going to run my management service. So as of 12.40, there's a new service, which you may or may not be aware of, called the Qlik Service Dispatcher. That's the new license service that shows up in the management console. That's really only used if you're running the dual use licensing, to where you're running a Sense environment and a QlikView environment off the same license keys. You can do that, but you need to talk to your account manager if you want to do so. And then if they give you that dual use license, that's where this service dispatcher service would come into play. You'd want to make sure that guy's running, because without that, things wouldn't work correctly. And that service always goes with the management service, just FYI as well. So let's just go through these. So on server 3, I've already done the install. So I've got my directory service, and I've got my distribution service over here. And then on server 4, I've got my extra distribution service node only. On server 5, I've got my other directory service. I've got my QlikView, my first QlikView server service, or my primary, and my web server service. And then on server 6, I have my extra QlikView server node there. The primary one we're going to work on here is going to be server 2. Now, as you know, in doing the clustering and stuff, we've got to go to a UNC path. I've got everything local on the single node, but we're going to have to switch to a file share. So I set up a folder for my PGO files, my publisher app data folder. The QDS notification, you can separate the notification files from the app data. We're not going to do that today because I'm going to be running short on time. Source documents, I'm going to put those here. And then the QlikView server, I need an alternate temp folder for print and send to Excel files to go to. I created one for my logs, and I've got one for my user documents. So I've got all these. Now the other thing I need to do here is I need to go grab, so I'm going to go back to server 1, and over here I'm going to go to program data, QlikTech, management service, QVPR, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a Control A, but then I'm going to deselect Control Qlik on backups, and I'm going to grab these guys, okay, and then I'm going to go back to server 2, which is my new management server. Okay, I'm going to do a new file explorer here. And I'm going to go to C, oops, come on, program data, QlikTech, management service. Okay, now what I need to do here, just to be safe, I'm going to stop the management service, so it's not trying to update files and stuff while I'm changing things over. And then I need to get to the right browser. Okay, I'm just going to rename this QVPR folder and put a _old on him. The help is going to recommend that you change this ini file as well. You don't need to, though. You can leave that guy alone. All you really need to do is just rename that QVPR file. And then I'm just going to right-click, new folder, and I'm going to create a new QVPR folder. And I'm going to go into him, and I'm going to do a paste. The XMLDB viewer, I already copied the executable over here. Make sure when you run this, you do a right-click, run as administrator. If you don't, when you try to change things and do a save, it's going to fail on you. I'm going to do Open Database, and I'm going to browse to see Program Data, Qlik Tech, Management Service, my new QVPR folder. Do OK. Now I'm running the same version in both environments, so I don't have the upgrade piece, so my about is 1240 SR3 in both environments, so that's not going to change. The old QVPR is going to have an old DB details here, so you'll see your old version, but when we finish making the changes here and you start the management service, it's going to update and add a new row here with the new version as well, just FYI. So if you do see one, if you don't see one, it's because the schema hasn't changed between the releases that you upgraded from and to. Just an FYI on that. The concept of the migration is we're migrating services. So the catch is we need to tell the management service where to find the services in the new environment. So what we want to do is change the service URLs in the QVPR files to point to the new servers in the new environment. So the easiest way to do that, given I've got a single server, is I just do a search on Qlik server 1, and I do find, and it goes and finds all the files in the QVPR folder that have references to Qlik server 1. So this gives me a list of the places that I need to potentially make changes. And this is kind of where, remember I was talking about, let's go to this first one here. So on my distribution service, so here's the name, QDS at Qlik server. This is why I'm recommending making this generic, because the name can be anything. It's just a name. It's not linked to anything. It's not a key. It's just a name to tell you what it is. So you can call it whatever you want, but if you make it generic, then when you do these migrations, you don't have to worry about changing these as well so that people don't get confused. Now, that doesn't mean if you're going from, say, a dev and you're doing a migration to a prod that you couldn't, delete dev and add prod, so change the name that way. That would be just fine. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Right now, my service address is Qlik server 1. So what I want to do, my new distribution service is on server 3. Management services is on server 2. The first publisher was on server 3. So I'm going to change that to server 3. I need to click out of that cell, and then I can do Save Table. And it's going to say yes, and then I can make sure that stayed on 3. And then what I do is I do a find. That gets rid of that row for me, so I know I've fixed that record. Okay, so the next thing is our directory service connector. That's also on server 1. And if you remember right, I put the first instance of that on the same box as the publisher. So I'm going to change this to server 3 as well. And we'll click out and do save and say yes. And then we'll do a find, pardon me. Okay, now I've got the license service. I'm going to go ahead and change this guy. This needs to be the new management service server. So I'm going to change that from 1 to 2 because we've got the management service and that license service running on server 2. Click out of there, and I'll go ahead and change this while I'm here too. And this is a server name. The problem is you can't change this one in the management console. You have to manually do this one in the, but you could, the name of this could be anything, so you could leave the 2 off there, but I'm going to leave it there just because that's it. There's only one instance of it in the environment, so that way I know where it is. Okay, click out of there, save, yes. Okay, find. Okay, now we're down to our QDS cluster file. So I just have one record currently. This is where my second record would go for the other cluster node, but we're just doing a single migration at the moment. So I'm going to use my primary, which is on server 3 again. Okay, so I click out of there, I do a save, and then I do another find. That record's gone. Okay, now my QlikView server, the primary node for the QlikView server, and you'll notice this is QVS cluster. So again, when we add that other cluster node, there's going to be a second row that appears in this file. But for right now, I only have one row. So I want to change this to be the primary QlikView server, which is going to be server 5 in the new environment. So I'm switching from 1 to 5. And at the same time, I'm going to change this internal ID, which is a server name, from 1 to 5 as well, so that everything ties out there. And click out of there, do a save, say yes, and do a find. Okay, and we're down to our web server. And if you remember correctly, our web server is going from server 1 to server 5 with the initial QlikView server node. So I change that. I do a save, yes, and do a find. All right, so that tells me I've got all my URLs correctly modified now. So I've got everything pointed to the correct locations. Since we're done there, let me just tell you real quickly. So source document folder resource, this is where, so my source, this is where my current source documents are located, is on C, program data, QlikTech. So what I would need to do, or what I can do here, if I want, is go grab my new UNC path source documents, path, and I can actually change this here, paste. And what this does, let me go ahead and do a save. Yep. What that does is I changed the path, but all these GUIDs stayed intact. And the catch is this guy right here. This is the folder GUID, 65C7. If I go to if I go to my source documents, you'll see the folder ID is 65C7. My template's different, but all my other ones are. So this is what you don't want to break. If this GUID changes here, and if you make a change via the management console, that likely is going to change on you. And if that changes, that's going to break your links to your source docs. So the fix to that, if it does happen, is what you can do, is come back and change the GUID that got assigned to this new folder, go back to your source document, grab that old folder ID, just copy it, and then come back into here and paste that back over this value, and that'll realign things to where everything should start working again. Okay? That's the only gotcha I can think of there. So let's go ahead and minimize this guy and minimize, let's go back here. Okay, let's minimize that real quick. Okay, let me go ahead and start the management service back up. And then let's go to the management console. We're on server 2. We're on the new management server box. And let's see where we're at. Services. Okay, so you can see I've got my management service on server 2, my distribution service, server 3, my license services on server 2, DSC on server 3, and my QlikView server and web server on server 5, whereas before everything was on server 1. Now, what we need to do is go add in the nodes for the other 2, which we can do that via the management console. And I'm not going to go ahead and do this just to save a little time, but what you would do for the QlikView server, you just come to the server resource, click the green button here, and then you just change the QVP URL. I would put QlikView server 6 in here, in this new one, and then hit apply. Just be sure you've got the control number for your license, because that's going to be required to add that new node, okay? And then you do the same thing for the distribution service, except you come into the general tab on it, and under the URL area, click the green plus button. And in this case, it would be server 4 is what I would change the 2 So it'd go 2 to 4. What can happen on this, and you would, in this case too, you would want to change your app data folder path at this point as well. You can see my source doc picked up the UNC path. I would want to change the app data folder path at the same time though to this guy. So I would just copy that, and over here I would just overwrite this guy and do a paste. Let me just delete that and do apply. Okay, but that's how you add that extra node. Okay, now let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, our takeaways. Make sure you review the help for the upgrade and migration, which I showed you before. You want to be sure to back up your key folders and files. Use the help again. Just walk through that, check the best practices and all the other areas. Make sure you've got everything you need there. Again, you don't want to change your source doc paths in the management console. Any existing ones, anything that's got tasks already assigned to it. If you change those in the management console, that GUID's going to change, which is going to break the link between the folder and the source documents. But we covered how to fix that in case you do it. You can go back and fix it. And hopefully now it makes sense. If you add new folders, you would need to add those new folders, and then it's a little tricky at that point. You have to figure out which source docs you want to repoint to the new folder GUIDs. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. And then lastly, the remote management service is not really for migrations and upgrades. It's really meant for migrating tasks between environments only. It's not meant as a full migration tool. And with that, I appreciate the time, and we'll move on to Q&A.
Okay, everyone, now is time for Q&A. Please submit your questions through the Q&A panel on the left side of your ON24 console. Brett, which question would you like to address first?
Okay, Troy, we've gotten some really good questions today. I'm really impressed with the session today. The first one, is there a way to see which QVWs/reload task use a particular QVD file? This is one I've seen a few times out on Community lately as well, but basically about the only thing I've got for you would be to check out the Governance Dashboard application. I'll provide a link to that out on Community. That's about the best thing I can think of that's going to show you which QVD files are used by which QVW files via publisher. So definitely check that out. Hopefully that'll do the trick for you. Okay, our next question is, which is the right version to upgrade to? That's a really good question. I don't have a really good answer. It's really up to you guys to decide what you want to do. I don't recommend going to an initial release unless you absolutely need the functionality that's coming out in that release. It's always good to wait for at least the first service release. If you can run it parallel in a test environment, that'd be an awesome way to go in that case. But I don't recommend doing it in a production environment. Historically hasn't done well in most cases. But as far as the release, the key thing is to look at the release note, look at the what's new, see what you need, what you don't need, or what you want or don't want, and try and make a decision that way. So if you're still in 1120, it's probably a lot harder decision than if you're on, say, 1230 and trying to figure out whether or not you want to go to 1240. You can just look at the what's new and figure out whether or not it's worthwhile making that jump while you're there. Hopefully that helps. Okay, our next question. Are there any special considerations when migrating to a virtualized environment? This is a really great question, and yes, there is. The couple key things I would say here are you want to make sure the CPU and memory resources allocated to that virtual machine are allocated up front on the boot of that VM. Dynamic assignment of resources does not work for us. We've got to have those resources available right away. And the dynamic option is just too slow. It'll basically cause you all kinds of stability issues in your environment. So make sure the resources are allocated just like it was a physical server. The other key thing is make sure that the host that VM is running on is not oversubscribed. If there are more VMs with more resources allocated than you have physically on the host, that's likely going to cause performance and stability issues for you as well. So just make sure that the VM guys check the host and know that it's not oversubscribed. Those are the two key things I'd point out on that one. Okay, our next question. Do you edit the QVPR before or after installing on the new QMS machine? So as we did in the presentation, I copied the QVPR files from the old environment to the new environment. Then I stopped the management service in the new environment, made my edits to the service URLs in those QVPR files, and then I renamed the QVPR folder, created a new one, and put those new files in that new folder, and then restarted the management service. And then everything was pointed to the correct servers in the new environment. So the trick is to be sure you do those edits before you start the service in the new environment with the QVPR files from the old environment. Let's go on to the next question here. How do you pre-license a QV server? So basically in your new environment, once you got everything installed on the correct servers, go ahead and start the services, start the management service. You can go ahead and do any changes that you want to make. You license QlikView server, license the publisher. The server licensing goes to the settings any file for QlikView server. The publisher license goes to the management service program data QlikTech management service folder in the publisher lef and the reg info text. So that information isn't going to be impacted by our QVPR changes. So you can go ahead and do that licensing ahead of time, and then when you bring the QVPR files over and make those changes, then when you fire those up, then the server's already licensed, you're all good to go, publisher. Everything will come into sync really quickly that way. Okay, our next question. If we want to upgrade QlikView as well as migrate, should we upgrade first or migrate first from 11.20? It really doesn't matter the version. It's really a personal choice, but I find in most cases what most customers are looking to do is they want to keep that old environment there just in case they have a problem with the upgrade and or the migration. So if you're doing an upgrade and migration, what I would probably recommend is you leave that existing environment where it is, because that gives you a solid place to go roll back to if you do have a problem with the new version. So I would install the new servers with the new version and then just do the QVPR, because like I said, when you bring those QVPR files over, when you first and you make the changes to everything to point to the new servers in the new environment, when you start the management service in the new environment, it will update the schemas on those files that we just changed and get them updated for the new version automatically. If that does hiccup, you can just go back and grab another copy of the QVPR files and start over, just modify them again. It does happen occasionally, but not often. But if it does, just grab another copy, do the same edits, and try again, and hopefully it'll go smoothly the second time. But that's how I would recommend going at that one. But it is up to you. If you want to do the upgrade in the old environment first, then do the migration. That's what the help says. But I have, I don't necessarily recommend that because most customers I've found want to be able to do that rollback. Okay, our next question, what is the application data folder for the QDS? So this is an interesting one too. For those of you who may not know, there's really two copies of your tasks in your environment. One copy is kept by the management service in the QVPR files. The other copy is in the QDS application data folder path. So all those folders and files you see are not only the logs, but it's also the task information, the trigger information, and everything else related to your task. So the management service can go down, and the QDS can still keep running all your tasks. So for those of you who may have been puzzled by why things were still running when your management service was unusable, that's why, because the QDS has its own set of files, so it knows what to do when. So that's what's going on there, as well as the log files go to that location as well. And the other thing I had mentioned earlier, that notification folder, that's just a way to make the QDSs more efficient. So if you have a clustered publisher environment, it may make sense to do that separate notification folder. And there's a new option in 1230 and later to where you can have a local temp folder on each of the QDS nodes so that you're not having temp files go out to a file share. That can be a significant performance improvement too. There's an article I've written on some key settings. I'll add that into the links to add to the presentation so you guys will have access to that because that's a handy article. Okay, and our last question, can you elaborate if there are any best practices if we move our QlikView VMs to Azure or AWS Cloud? For this one, I would highly recommend that you take advantage of our services organization. These guys have done a lot of implementations in a lot of different scenarios. The problem with me trying to give you guidance here is every use case is going to be different. What you're probably going to need to do is a full use case review, look at your existing architecture, make sure that that's solid for your use case, both current and where you want to go. And at the same time, so they'll do a full use case review, they'll do an architecture review, and they can help you figure out which server types and which storage types you want to be using in those environments. Things are constantly changing, and those guys generally do that work. So they're the best resource to hit to make sure you're getting the latest and greatest information on how best to do those moves. The other thing that comes into play is on-prem versus cloud pieces. A lot of customers keep some stuff on-prem and only a few things go out to the cloud. So that's another thing to where having the services guys in there helping you will make sure that all that goes smoothly for you as well. And with that, I think that's it. Thanks very much, everybody, for attending today.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this session. And thank you to Brett for presenting. We appreciate getting experts like Brett to share with us. Here's our legal disclaimer. And thank you once again. Have a great rest of your day.